Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory, January 15th, 1852. While fellow trappers Tom Mackenzie and Jake Morrison scrambled to erect their 12 by 10 canvas tent against 60-mile-per-hour winds, 45-year-old Metis guide Louis Beaumont was digging what they called his grave. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, he carved a trench into an 8-foot snowdrift while his companions mocked him mercilessly. Mackenzie called him a fool, said smart money was on canvas, an iron stove, not playing prairie dog in the frozen ground. Morrison laughed that the Metis had been in the mountains too long, thought he was a damn badger. They trusted proven frontier wisdom, canvas walls, roaring fire, 3 cords of pre-cut firewood. Louis trusted something else entirely. Knowledge passed down from his Cree grandmother about snow's hidden power as insulation. Then the blizzard hit without warning. Temperature plummeted to 28 below zero. Wind screamed at 70 miles per hour. The canvas tent, despite its roaring fire, dropped to 8 degrees below zero inside. Ice formed on the interior walls 3 feet from the flames. But Louis's grave? It held steady at 38 degrees above zero, a 45-degree difference, using nothing but body heat and the physics of snow. What did this half-French, half-Cree guide understand about thermodynamics that experienced American trappers dismissed as primitive foolishness? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The first snowflakes began falling at noon on January 15th, 1852, as Louis Beaumont checked the last trap line 15 miles from base camp in Wyoming Territory's Wind River Range. At 45, the Metis guide had survived 20 winters in these mountains, carrying knowledge from 2 worlds, his French voyageur father's systematic approach to wilderness construction and his Cree mother's understanding of how snow could become a life-saving ally rather than a killing enemy. The other 4 men in Tom Mackenzie's trapping party had dismissed the morning's gray sky as typical January weather, confident that their standard equipment would handle whatever the mountains delivered. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind had picked up to 30 miles per hour, and Mackenzie made the call that would define the next 12 hours. "We're not making it back to camp in this," the 38-year-old expedition leader announced, watching the snow thicken from scattered flakes to a steady curtain that cut visibility to less than 50 yards. Jake Morrison, 32 and built like the Ohio logger he'd been before heading west, nodded his agreement while shouldering his pack. "Good thing we brought the tent and enough firewood for a week." Pete Clancy, the youngest at 29 and still green after only 1 season in the mountains, looked nervous but trusted the older men's confidence. Dutch Herman, 41 and the most experienced after Louis, simply began scanning the terrain for a suitable campsite with the methodical eye of a Bavarian who'd survived alpine storms. Mackenzie selected a clearing protected by a stand of lodgepole pines, reasoning that the trees would break the wind while providing easy access to deadfall for additional firewood. The men immediately began the familiar routine they'd executed dozens of times: clear the snow down to bare ground, drive the iron tent stakes deep enough to hold against wind, stretch the 12 by 10 canvas tight as a drumhead. Morrison and Clancy worked together to assemble the portable sheet iron stove, while Herman organized their 3 cords of pre-cut firewood into neat stacks that would feed the fire through the night. This was frontier survival as every American mountain man understood it: manufactured materials, proven techniques, and enough fuel to generate the heat necessary to keep 5 men alive until morning. Louis watched their preparations with the quiet attention of a man who'd learned to read weather signs in 2 languages. The wind was building faster than normal, the snow falling with the dense consistency that meant serious accumulation, and the temperature dropping with the steady persistence that signaled a major storm system moving through the high country. More importantly, he recognized the signs his Cree grandmother had taught him to watch for: the way the wind swirled and eddied around the rocky outcrops, the depth and consistency of the snowdrifts that had built up over the previous weeks, the particular quality of light that meant the storm would intensify rather than pass quickly. While his companions struggled to erect the canvas in gusts that now reached 50 miles per hour, Lewis walked methodically through the area, testing snow depth with a long stick, examining the lee sides of ridges and rock formations, looking for what most white trappers would never recognize as the ideal building material. He found it in an 8-foot drift on the protected side of a granite ledge, snow that had been deposited layer by layer over weeks of smaller storms, packed and aged until it had the density and structural integrity that could be cut into blocks and shaped into walls. To Morrison and the others, it looked like just another snowbank. To Lewis, it represented the raw materials for a shelter that would outperform their tent by every measurable standard. When Lewis began digging, methodically excavating snow with the precision of a man following an ancient blueprint, the mockery started immediately. "Metis is digging his own grave," Mackenzie called out, pausing in his fight with the tent stakes to watch Lewis carve what looked like a man-sized trench. "Gonna freeze to death in a hole while we're staying warm by the fire." Morrison, wrestling with canvas that whipped and snapped in the wind like a living thing, shook his head in disbelief. "Smart money's on canvas and iron stove, not playing prairie dog in the snow." Even Dutch, normally respectful of different approaches, couldn't hide his skepticism. "Louis been in mountains too long, thinks he's a damn badger instead of a man." The dimensions Lewis carved were precise, based on calculations that none of the other men would have understood, even if he'd tried to explain them. 6 feet long to accommodate his body length, 3 feet wide to minimize the air volume his body heat would need to warm, 4 feet deep to get below the wind layer and create thick, insulating walls on all sides. Every measurement came from generations of Cree knowledge about the relationship between human heat output, air volume, and the insulating properties of properly packed snow. His grandmother had taught him that snow, when dense enough and thick enough, could trap air better than any manufactured material, creating barriers that would hold body heat with mathematical precision. As the afternoon wore on and the storm intensified, the contrast between the two approaches became impossible to ignore. The tent party fought for every inch of progress, their canvas straining against stakes that pulled loose in the frozen ground, their fire struggling to establish itself in the wind-whipped clearing. Louis worked steadily and quietly, cutting blocks of snow with his handsaw, lining the floor of his trench with a 6-inch layer of spruce boughs for insulation from the ground, constructing a framework of interlaced saplings that would support a roof of snow blocks. By the time the tent was finally erected and the fire blazing, Louis had created something that looked like nothing more than a shallow grave covered with his buffalo robe, but followed principles of thermal dynamics that would prove themselves when the real test began. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wind had reached sustained speeds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts that hammered the canvas tent like invisible fists. Inside the 12 by 10 shelter, Mackenzie, Morrison, Clancy, and Herman huddled around their sheet iron stove, feeding it a steady diet of split pine that consumed nearly a quarter cord every hour just to maintain a fighting chance against the cold. The internal temperature held at 15 degrees above zero, barely warm enough to prevent immediate frostbite, but far from comfortable. Drafts penetrated every seam where the canvas panels joined, carrying knifing currents of air that found every gap in their wool clothing and reminded them constantly that their shelter was little more than a wind-permeable barrier between them and the storm. The mathematics of their situation were brutal, though none of them had calculated the numbers explicitly. Their tent enclosed roughly 1,200 cubic feet of airspace that needed constant heating, while the canvas walls provided an insulation value barely better than wearing a cotton shirt in a blizzard. Every BTU generated by their fire fought against wind infiltration that pulled heated air through the fabric and replaced it with sub-zero cold from outside. The iron stove, designed for heating small cabins with proper walls and insulation, struggled against the impossible task of warming a space that leaked heat as fast as the fire could produce it. 50 yards away, Louis completed his final preparations as darkness settled over the mountains. He had spent the last 2 hours refining details that would make the difference between comfort and survival, adjusting the roof framework of interlaced saplings until it could support the weight of snow blocks without sagging, positioning his breathing hole to ensure adequate ventilation without creating a thermal drain, arranging his single wool blanket and buffalo robe to maximize heat retention around his body. The dimensions of his shelter represented 20 years of accumulated knowledge about human thermal requirements, 72 cubic feet of airspace that his body could heat and maintain, walls of packed snow 3 to 4 feet thick that would store and gradually release warmth, and a design that eliminated wind infiltration completely. The physics working in Louis's favor were invisible but measurable. Snow, when properly dense and aged, contained 90% trapped air, giving it an insulation value of approximately 1 R unit per inch of thickness. His 4-foot walls provided an R value of 48, equivalent to 16 inches of modern fiberglass insulation, compared to the canvas tent's R value of less than 1. More critically, his shelter would operate as a closed thermal system, where his body's natural heat output of 350 to 400 BTU per hour would be more than adequate to maintain comfortable temperatures in the small, well-insulated space. At 8 o'clock, as the temperature outside dropped toward 25 below zero, the contrast between the two survival strategies became impossible to ignore. Inside the tent, the 4 men took turns feeding wood to their fire in a desperate rotation that consumed their carefully stockpiled fuel at an alarming rate. They had burned through 1.5 cords already and faced the mathematical certainty that their remaining wood would not last until dawn. Ice began forming on the interior walls of the tent where their breath condensed and froze, creating a layer of frost that grew thicker with each passing hour, despite the roaring fire just 3 feet away. Morrison stamped his feet constantly to maintain circulation, already feeling the first warning signs of frostbite in his toes, despite wool socks and leather boots that had served him well in milder conditions. Clancy kept his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, pulling them out only when absolutely necessary to tend the fire or adjust his position. The wind outside had increased to sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour, creating a sound like a continuous freight train that made conversation difficult and sleep impossible. Louis, meanwhile, had sealed himself into his snow trench with the systematic precision of a man following a proven procedure. He extinguished the small warming fire he'd used during construction, knowing that open flame in such a confined space would quickly consume his limited oxygen supply. The buffalo robe stretched across his roof framework created an effective seal broken only by the 4-inch breathing hole he'd positioned carefully to prevent carbon dioxide buildup while minimizing heat loss. Within 30 minutes of sealing the entrance, the temperature inside his shelter stabilized at 38 degrees above zero, a remarkable 73-degree differential from the outside air. The science behind Louis's comfort was elegant in its simplicity. His body heat, trapped within the small air volume and held by walls that functioned as thermal batteries, created a sustainable microclimate that required no external fuel source. The snow walls absorbed heat during his active periods and released it gradually, moderating temperature swings and maintaining steady warmth through the night. Most importantly, the complete elimination of wind meant that every BTU his body produced stayed within the shelter instead of being stripped away by convection. At 10 o'clock, Mackenzie made a desperate offer through the howling wind, shouting toward the barely visible mound that marked Louis's position. $20 gold, Louis. Abandon that death trap and share our tent. The response was silence, not because Louis couldn't hear, but because he was already settling into the kind of restful sleep that would be impossible for the men fighting for survival in their canvas prison. His internal temperature held steady at 37 degrees, his breathing was regular and relaxed, and his body had stopped shivering completely within the first hour of occupation. Inside the tent, the 4 men faced a crisis that would only worsen as the night progressed. Their fuel consumption had accelerated to unsustainable levels, their shelter was failing to provide adequate protection despite their best efforts, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. They had committed to a survival strategy that depended entirely on external energy input, firewood that was running out, while Louis had chosen a method that worked with natural forces rather than fighting against them. The long night ahead would prove definitively which approach understood the true nature of winter survival in the high country. Midnight brought the storm's full fury as temperatures plunged to 28 degrees below zero and winds reached sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour, with gusts hammering the mountainside at 75. Inside the canvas tent, what had begun as uncomfortable cold transformed into a life-threatening emergency that no amount of determination could overcome. The internal temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, despite the roaring fire that consumed wood faster than the men could feed it. Mackenzie, Morrison, Clancy, and Herman huddled together in the tent's center, sharing body heat while ice formed on the canvas walls just 3 feet from the flames. The brutal mathematics of their situation had become undeniable. They had burned through 2.5 cords of their carefully stockpiled firewood in 6 hours, leaving them with less than half a cord to survive until dawn. At their current consumption rate, the wood would be gone by 2 in the morning, leaving them defenseless against temperatures that would kill them within hours. Morrison's left foot had gone completely numb despite constant movement, the leather of his boots providing no meaningful protection against cold that penetrated through wool socks as if they were made of paper. Clancy's fingertips had turned white and painful, the early stages of frostbite that would worsen rapidly without intervention. The wind chill factor outside created effective temperatures approaching 65 degrees below zero, but even inside their shelter, the men faced conditions that overwhelmed their body's ability to generate heat. The canvas walls, designed to shed rain rather than retain warmth, allowed wind infiltration that stripped away every BTU the fire produced almost as quickly as the flames could release it. Ice crystals formed from their exhaled breath coated every interior surface, creating a layer of frost that grew thicker each hour and served as visible proof that their shelter was failing catastrophically. 50 yards away, Louis slept soundly in conditions that would have seemed impossible to his struggling companions. His snow trench maintained a steady internal temperature of 35 degrees above zero, a remarkable 63-degree differential from the outside air, using nothing more than the heat generated by his resting body. The thick snow walls functioned as thermal batteries, storing warmth during the evening hours when his body temperature was highest, and releasing it gradually through the night to maintain steady comfort. The complete absence of wind within his sealed shelter meant that every BTU his body produced remained trapped within the small air volume, creating a sustainable microclimate that required no external energy source. The physics of Louis's success would not be fully understood by scientists for decades, but the practical results were undeniable. His shelter operated on principles that the Cree had refined through countless generations of prairie winters, using the Earth's natural insulation properties rather than fighting against them, minimizing air volume to match human heat output, and eliminating wind infiltration completely. The 4-foot thickness of his snow walls provided insulation equivalent to 16 inches of modern fiberglass, while the tent's canvas walls offered protection barely better than heavy clothing. At 2 in the morning, the crisis in the tent reached its breaking point. The last scraps of firewood crackled and burned, while Herman desperately fed strips of canvas and leather into the flames in a final attempt to maintain some source of heat. The internal temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and hypothermia symptoms were manifesting in all 4 men. Morrison's speech had begun slurring as his core body temperature dropped, while Clancy's hands shook uncontrollably despite being buried deep in his coat pockets. Mackenzie and Herman, though still functional, recognized that they had perhaps 2 hours before cold-induced unconsciousness would claim the group. The sound of axes splitting wood had stopped completely, replaced by the desperate scraping of men trying to find combustible materials in their equipment. Boot leather, canvas repair patches, and wooden tent stakes disappeared into the flames as the 4 trappers burned everything they possessed in a losing battle against physics and weather that showed no mercy to inadequate preparation. The ice on the tent walls continued to thicken, fed by breath vapor that froze instantly in air too cold to hold moisture, creating a crystalline coating that reflected their flickering firelight like a frozen tomb. Louis, unaware of the crisis unfolding nearby, experienced the deep, restorative sleep of a man whose shelter performed exactly as generations of indigenous knowledge promised it would. His breathing remained steady and regular, his circulation functioned normally, and his body temperature stayed within the comfortable range that allowed genuine rest rather than the exhausted unconsciousness that would soon claim the tent's occupants. The breathing hole in his roof maintained adequate air circulation without creating thermal drain, while the buffalo robe seal held his body heat as effectively as the walls of a well-built cabin. At 4 in the morning, as the outside temperature stabilized at its coldest point, and the wind continued its relentless assault on the mountainside, the contrast between the two survival methods had become absolute. The tent contained 4 men fighting a losing battle against hypothermia, their core temperatures dropping steadily as their shelter failed to provide meaningful protection despite consuming enormous quantities of fuel. Morrison's left foot showed clear signs of serious frostbite, while Clancy's fingertips had progressed from white to the waxy yellow that indicated tissue damage. Herman and Mackenzie, though still conscious, displayed the slurred speech and confused thinking that marked the onset of severe hypothermia. Lewis's trench, meanwhile, maintained its steady 37 degrees above zero, providing a 75-degree advantage over the outside air through the elegant application of principles that required no manufactured materials, no external fuel, and no continuous human effort. His shelter had reached thermal equilibrium hours earlier, creating conditions that could be sustained indefinitely using only the heat generated by normal bodily functions. The storm that was killing the men in the tent served only to add additional insulation to his snow walls, making his shelter warmer and more comfortable as the night progressed. Dawn broke gray and bitter at 7 in the morning on January 16th, with temperatures still holding at 22 degrees below zero, and winds that had decreased only slightly to 30 miles per hour. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow and a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien world, but the crisis it had created was far from over. Inside the canvas tent, 4 men faced the consequences of a survival strategy that had failed catastrophically despite their best efforts and years of frontier experience. The tent itself told the story of the night's battle in visible damage that spoke louder than words. Canvas torn in 3 places by wind stress flapped uselessly in the morning air, while the interior walls were coated with half an inch of ice formed from breath vapor that had frozen and accumulated throughout the long hours. Every piece of their carefully stockpiled firewood had been consumed by 5 in the morning, along with tent stakes, leather equipment, and anything else that would burn in their desperate attempt to maintain life-sustaining heat. The final internal temperature, measured when the last flames died, had reached 15 degrees below zero, cold enough to kill a sleeping man within hours. The medical toll was immediate and serious. Morrison's left foot showed the waxy yellow discoloration and wooden rigidity of severe frostbite that had progressed beyond the reversible stage during the final hours when the fire failed completely. 3 of his toes were completely numb and would likely require amputation if infection didn't claim his entire foot first. Clancy's fingertips on both hands displayed the characteristic white and red blotching of moderate frostbite, painful but probably recoverable with proper care. Herman and Mackenzie had escaped permanent tissue damage, but both showed the slurred speech, confusion, and exhaustion that marked their narrow escape from hypothermia-induced death. The contrast became stark when Louis emerged from his snow shelter, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had enjoyed 8 hours of comfortable sleep. His physical condition was that of someone who had spent the night in a warm cabin rather than surviving the worst blizzard in recent memory. No frostbite marked his fingers or toes, no hypothermia symptoms clouded his thinking, and no exhaustion slowed his movements as he began the simple process of packing his gear. The temperature inside his trench, when he opened it to the morning air, still registered 32 degrees above zero, a 54-degree advantage over the outside air that had been maintained through the night using nothing more than his body heat and the insulating properties of properly applied snow. Mackenzie, despite his injuries and exhaustion, possessed enough frontier honesty to acknowledge what he had witnessed. "Lewis, I owe you an apology and my life," he said through lips still blue from cold exposure, his words carrying the weight of a man who had looked death in the face and recognized his own ignorance. The other men nodded their agreement, their mockery of the previous evening replaced by the desperate hunger of students who had learned their ignorance nearly cost them everything. Morrison, cradling his frostbitten foot, asked the question that would echo through the Rocky Mountain region for decades. Teach me to build one of those holes. The numbers that mattered were impossible to ignore. Louis had achieved a 45 to 50 degree temperature differential using zero fuel, while the tent party had consumed more than 3 cords of firewood and still suffered life-threatening cold exposure. His shelter had required 2 hours of construction time and provided 8 hours of comfortable sleep, while their tent had taken 90 minutes to erect in fighting winds and delivered nothing but a slow march toward hypothermia. Most critically, his method had resulted in 0 injuries, while their conventional approach had produced permanent disability and nearly killed 4 experienced mountain men. The knowledge transfer began immediately, driven by the urgent recognition that survival in the high country required techniques none of them had learned during their frontier education. Louis explained the physics with the patient precision of a teacher who understood that lives depended on accurate information. Snow became natural insulation when thick enough and properly packed, providing thermal protection equivalent to manufactured materials these men had never seen. Small air volume was critical because human bodies could only generate limited heat, making large spaces impossible to warm effectively. Underground construction eliminated wind infiltration completely, while proper ventilation prevented suffocation and condensation problems that would compromise the shelter's effectiveness. The critical dimensions were specific and non-negotiable. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, created the optimal ratio of insulation to air volume for a single person. Larger meant impossible to heat. Smaller meant inadequate sleeping space and increased risk of carbon dioxide buildup. The floor required 6 inches of insulating material, spruce boughs, pine needles, or dried grass, to prevent ground cold from drawing heat away from the occupant's body. The roof framework needed to support snow weight while maintaining structural integrity, achieved through interlaced saplings positioned to distribute load evenly across the walls. Site selection followed principles that most white trappers had never considered, but that meant the difference between success and failure. Deep snowdrifts provided the raw material, but only certain types worked effectively. Snow that had been deposited gradually and packed naturally over multiple storms rather than loose powder that would collapse or compress under construction loads. Lee sides of ridges or rock formations offered protection from wind during construction and provided the stable base necessary for excavation. Proper drainage was essential to prevent water accumulation that would destroy insulation properties and create deadly conditions. Mackenzie, despite his condition, made a promise that would change winter survival practices throughout the territory. Every man learns this technique before next winter. The practical proof was undeniable. Traditional indigenous knowledge had outperformed accepted frontier practice by measurable margins that represented the difference between life and death. Morrison, facing the probability of losing toes to frostbite, became an immediate convert despite his injuries. Herman and Clancy, sobered by their brush with hypothermia, requested detailed instruction in construction methods they had dismissed as primitive just 12 hours earlier. Lewis's response was characteristic of the quiet competence that had saved his life. No lectures about superior knowledge, no complaints about the mockery he had endured, just shared information that could keep other men alive when the mountains showed their true face. The conversion was complete, the lesson learned in the most convincing way possible through direct experience of the consequences when conventional wisdom proved inadequate against the unforgiving arithmetic of extreme weather and human physiology. By May of 1852, word of Louis Beaumont's snow shelter technique had spread through the Rocky Mountain fur trade with the speed that only life-saving knowledge could achieve. Mackenzie's detailed report to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company described not just the events of that January night, but the precise measurements, construction methods, and thermal performance that had saved one man's life while nearly claiming 4 others. Morrison, despite losing 2 toes to frostbite, became the technique's most vocal advocate throughout Wyoming territory, demonstrating the excavation method to every trapper who would listen and carrying hand-drawn diagrams that showed the critical 6 by 3 by 4 foot dimensions that made the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The company's response was immediate and systematic. By late spring, official directives required all winter guides to learn what had become known as the Beaumont technique, and company supply lists began including small handsaws specifically designed for cutting snow blocks. The method spread beyond individual survival into organized expedition protocol, with experienced guides teaching the excavation principles to greenhorns before they ever set foot in the high country. The knowledge transfer was comprehensive, covering not just construction, but site selection, ventilation requirements, and the thermal physics that made 4 feet of snow walls equivalent to the insulation of a well-built cabin. During the winter of 1852 to 53, 12 documented cases proved the technique's reliability under conditions that claimed lives among those still relying on conventional canvas and fire methods. Montana guides developed a 2-person version using 8 by 4 by 4 foot dimensions, while Colorado miners adapted the technique for above tree-line camping, where wind speeds routinely exceeded what canvas could withstand. Canadian voyageurs incorporated the method into their winter travel protocols, recognizing that the ability to create effective shelter using only snow and simple tools could mean the difference between successful trade expeditions and frozen corpses discovered in spring thaws. The harsh winter of 1854 to 55 provided the ultimate test of the technique's adoption throughout the Rocky Mountain region. At least 23 lives were documented as saved by snow shelters during storms that killed trappers and miners, still depending on manufactured materials and external fuel sources. The method had evolved beyond emergency survival into standard winter camping practice. With experienced guides capable of excavating effective shelters in 2 hours that would maintain 40-degree temperature differentials for weeks of continuous occupation. Tool development followed practical needs identified through widespread use. Rocky Mountain trappers began carrying specialized snow saws with curved blades that cut blocks more efficiently than straight-edge tools. Portable frames made from bent willows created standardized block sizes that ensured structural integrity across different snow conditions. Regional variations developed based on local materials and climate patterns, but the fundamental principles remained constant: minimize air volume to match human heat output, maximize wall thickness for insulation, and eliminate wind infiltration completely through underground construction. The scientific validation came gradually, as educated men encountered the technique and began measuring its performance with instruments that confirmed what indigenous knowledge had understood for generations. Army engineers stationed at frontier posts recorded temperature differentials of 40 to 50 degrees between snow shelters and canvas tents during identical weather conditions. Military medical officers documented 0 cases of frostbite among soldiers using snow caves compared to 20% injury rates in conventional winter camps. By 1876, the United States Army's official cold weather survival manual included detailed snow cave construction instructions based directly on principles that Louis had learned from his Cree grandmother. The technique spread into civilian education systems, marked its transition from frontier survival method to documented scientific knowledge. Mountaineering clubs formed in eastern cities began teaching snow shelter construction based on Rocky Mountain techniques, recognizing that alpine climbing required understanding of thermal dynamics that most manufactured equipment could not provide. Engineering schools studied the insulation properties of snow, quantifying the R values and thermal mass effects that explained why the technique worked so reliably. The physics of heat transfer, thermal equilibrium, and insulation were finally catching up to knowledge that indigenous peoples had refined through practical application across thousands of years. Modern vindication came through systematic testing that proved every aspect of the technique's superiority over conventional methods. Military SEER training programs incorporated snow cave construction as primary winter survival skills, with thermometer measurements confirming that properly built shelters maintained the same 40-degree temperature advantages that Louis had achieved in 1852. Survival schools documented construction times, fuel requirements, and success rates that validated indigenous knowledge through scientific methodology. Search and rescue teams adopted the techniques as standard protocol for emergency winter shelter, recognizing that understanding these principles could save lives when modern equipment failed or was unavailable. The numbers told a story that transcended cultural prejudices and technological assumptions. Conservative estimates suggested that snow shelter techniques derived from Louis' demonstration had saved more than 200 lives in the Rocky Mountain region between 1852 and 1900. The consistent 40 to 50 degree temperature advantage over manufactured shelters had been measured thousands of times using modern instruments that confirmed the accuracy of observations made by men with no formal scientific training. Construction times of 2 to 3 hours compared favorably to tent setup that became impossible in severe weather, while zero fuel requirements eliminated the logistical challenges that had nearly killed Mackenzie's party. Success rates approaching 100% for properly constructed snow caves stood in stark contrast to the 60 to 70% survival rates documented for canvas and fire methods under extreme conditions. The technique had proven itself across different snow types, elevation ranges, and weather patterns throughout the North American mountain regions, demonstrating the universal applicability of principles that transcended specific geographic or cultural contexts. The lasting truth emerged through decades of practical application and scientific study. Preparation for the worst case was not paranoia, but survival itself. Louis Beaumont never claimed to have invented anything, never sought recognition for his knowledge, and never profited from techniques that saved hundreds of lives. He simply knew what worked because his grandmother had taught him, because the Cree had survived 10,000 winters, and because sometimes the old ways were not primitive but perfected through generations of testing against conditions that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Today's wilderness survival instructors teach the same 6 by 3 by 4 foot dimensions that Louis excavated 170 years ago, proving that physics and the life-saving potential of doing it right the first time remain unchanged by technological progress or cultural assumptions about superior methods.